if the government could mandate wages, if the government could set wages and make everybody happy, it wouldn't be the United States that was the most dominant economic power in the world. It would be the Soviet Union.
Andy, thanks so much for being here. Let me just read a brief biography. Andrew F. Puzder was Chief Executive Officer of CKE Restaurants for more than 16 years. For over a decade, he was a commercial trial lawyer in St. Louis. He was nominated by then President-elect Trump to be the U.S. Secretary of Labor. He holds a J.D. from the Washington University School of Law. We're here today to discuss his book, The Capitalist Comeback, which in its opening week was the #1 Amazon bestseller in economic policy, was the #2 bestseller in the business category, and which was in the top 100 best-selling books on all of Amazon. So congratulations on all that success, and thank you very much for being here.
Well, thanks, Mike. It's my pleasure to be here, and I never get tired of hearing all that good news about the book.
You're carrying out an exhaustive schedule trying to promote the book, and that actually brings me to the first question I want to ask. You're doing something unusual with the proceeds from this book. You're going to donate all the profit to charity, which is something that you don't hear very often among people who write books, and I wonder if you want to just talk a little about that.
Yeah, I didn't want people to think I was doing this for the money, quite honestly, even though it's a book about capitalism and profit. I was on a show this morning, and it occurred to me that I should probably donate it to charities that encourage entrepreneurship in the minority community, because I think capitalism, free enterprise needs to be a level playing field, and anything we can do to help level that playing field is important. So that's where the money's going to go. I loved writing the book. It was a labor of love. And I think charity's the right place for the profits to go.
Well, it's certainly a great cause, and obviously a wonderful thing to do with the profit. So I'm glad that we are able to discuss that a bit. And I want to get back to the subject of minority communities and entrepreneurship. But first, I want to ask you. It's unusual for someone who's been a corporate CEO to have worked in the same industry as a minimum wage worker. And I want to ask you, first, if you could just, talk a little bit about your background and kind of how you, started on the bottom rung of the employment ladder, and what being a minimum wage worker in the restaurant industry taught you when you took the helm as CEO.
Well, I worked to get through college and law school, and by the time I graduated from law school, I was married, I had 2 kids, and my wife was pregnant. So and Washington University is not an inexpensive place to go to school, as any parent could tell you. But I started out working minimum wage at Baskin Robbins in Chagrin Falls, Ohio, and learned a lot about showing up on time, about how to work on a team. I learned about inventory. I worked the register and learned about how sales tax worked. It was a job where you really get an education that you don't get in school. You're not going to get in college, and I think for a working class kid like me, it's kind of gives you a leg up on maybe the wealthier kids that don't get that kind of education. Then I went on. I painted houses. I landscaped. I cut grass. I think we called it, fancy word was landscaping. We were just 2 guys and me in a pickup truck. I busted up concrete in St. Louis in the middle of the summer with a jackhammer and threw the chunks on the back of a truck while I was in law school between my first and second year, because you can't get a job in law after 1 year. And I can tell you I was in really good shape after that summer, but it was not the most enjoyable job I ever had. So I did get that sort of working class experience prior to becoming a lawyer. There was my family. I had a great family. My dad and mom were wonderful. My dad worked, my mom didn't. There were 5 kids, but there was no money to give me to go to school, and I didn't qualify for any of the government programs that would have given me money to go to school. So if I wanted to do it, I had to do it. Luckily, I lived in a country that had a path where I could do it, and finally did.
And what did those experiences do to your perspective when you were sitting in the C-suite making decisions for CKE?
Well, they influenced a lot of what I did in the C-suite. I can remember, I remember what it was like, maybe not to have the money for rent or for food at the end of the month, and you got kids, and how terrible do you feel when you may not be able to, to pay for groceries, or to, are you going to have enough to cover the electric bill? And I have great sympathy for people in those circumstances because I lived through that, and it had a big influence on the policies we would implement in the company. And I'd say it had a very substantial influence.
Do you want to talk a little about CKE? When you took the helm, the company was near bankruptcy, and there was really a kind of a storied turnaround. And if that's something you'd like to just tell the story.
Sure.
of.
CKE was started by a guy named Carl Karcher who bought a hot dog cart in 1941. 8th grade education, moved to California from Ohio. Within a few years, he had 4 or 5 hot dog carts. Soon after that, he had a restaurant, and in 1956, he and his wife Margaret opened a little hot dog stand, which they called Carl's Jr. The restaurant was called Carl's, and the little hot dog stand was Carl's Jr. I became Carl's lawyer and represented him for a number of years. He was a really great guy, the quintessential self-made man. By the time I left the company, we had 3,800 restaurants in 45 states and 40 foreign countries, all from that little hot dog cart. In fact, I dedicated the book to Carl. If you look at the beginning, it's dedicated him in his comment. He said, "The American dream is alive and well in this country of ours. I know it. I lived it." So he did understand the American dream, and I think I understood it as well because of the circumstances of my life. So when I took the company over as a lawyer, most people in the industry thought I was going to take it into bankruptcy or sell it, because why else would you have a lawyer be CEO? I realized pretty quick that would have been terrible for the employees of the company. It would have been they'd have lost their jobs. It would have been terrible for the franchisees who would have lost their investments, and these people had families. It would have been terrible for our lenders who had about $700 million loaned to Carl's and Hardee's, CKE Restaurants. And 26 banks on our line of credit. 13 of them had us in workout, which basically means we want our money now. And within a very short period of time, we turned that around. We refinanced. We got down to 5 banks. We got sales going on a positive trend. They'd been negative for years. We got them on a positive trend. We added thick burgers and black Angus beef, and used some ads that I've been criticized for, but those darn ads saved the company. And so we turned it around, and I'm very proud of what we did. And now, like I said, worldwide, we had probably 115,000 employees when I left.
And they all had jobs because...
They all had jobs. Now, a lot of them worked for franchisees. The company owned about 5% of the restaurants, but they all had jobs.
So let's talk about jobs. In the book, you often return to this theme of the benefits that a job can bring, and of course, everybody knows that jobs bring paychecks. But you're talking about something that goes far beyond just a paycheck, and I wonder if you could share your thoughts on that.
Sure. I tell you, the proudest day of my professional career was the day that franchisee who owned the Baskin Robbins where I worked called me into her office and said, "Here's the key. You're going to get a 10-cent raise and you can open in the morning. You're now the assistant manager." And I'll tell you, the next morning I went into that Baskin Robbins, and I'll bet within half an hour it was the cleanest Baskin Robbins in America. I felt like I had done something, like I owned something, like I was part of something, like I could move forward in life. It's the kind of thing that keeps you out of gangs. It keeps you in school. It keeps you tied to your family. It keeps you shooting for something better and something further down the line. And as I said before, thank God we live in a country where you can keep setting that target down the line and keep moving ahead. My grandfather moved here from Slovakia, where had he stayed there and had I been born, I probably would have died a peasant farmer, somewhere in the Slovakian wilderness. We have this wonderful country where you can do that, and I think those entry-level jobs mean so much for people. Having a job means so much. It's like when your parents give you money versus when you earn money. Now, you actually had to have earned money to know how that feels. But trust me, if you haven't, and I know you have, but for those who haven't, trust me, it's better when you earn it than when you're given it. And the same thing's true when the government's giving you money. It's much better. If you're self-sustaining, you're supporting your family, that's something to be proud of. And having pride and dignity and self-respect is very meaningful. Arthur talks about that at length.
Sure.
Arthur Brooks. He's right. There's a dignity that comes with this that you just can't replace.
Now, it's common in the discourse about employment today to hear people talk about bad jobs, and you hear that phrase a lot. And you're even seeing some members of the U.S. Senate from the Democratic Party come forward with proposals for guaranteed jobs for all Americans that are quote unquote good jobs that pay, $15 an hour or whatever. I wonder if you could reflect on the idea that a job can be a bad job.
Yeah, there's no bad jobs. That's just not true. And they would say that a lot about jobs in quick service restaurants like Carl's Jr. and Hardee's. But we've trained America's workforce since the 50s and 60s. You come in, if you're coming out of high school, you can't afford to go to college, you're a working class kid like I was, maybe you're trying to make a few extra dollars. You go into a restaurant and work, and I got to tell you, for the first 2-3 months, I don't care. You can be getting paid $7.25 an hour. That business is losing money on you. Jobs, certain jobs only produce so much economic value. And the government can't mandate that jobs produce, that people are paid more than the economic value the job produces, or the businesses go out of business. If the government could mandate wages, if the government could set wages and make everybody happy, it wouldn't be the United States that was the most dominant economic power in the world. It would be the Soviet Union, which of course disappeared. When you look down at North Korea and South Korea at night, it would be North Korea that was lit up and South Korea that was dark. When you look at Venezuela, which, in 2011, Bernie Sanders said, you can't find the American dream in America anymore. You have to find it in countries like Venezuela. Who's the banana republic now? Well, somebody should ask him today, who's the banana republic now? The people in Venezuela, which when he made that statement was the richest country in South America. The people are starving, they're eating garbage, they can't get medical care. There's a problem with immigrants coming out of Venezuela to all the surrounding countries because they're trying to get themselves and their families out because they're starving to death. This is a terrible situation, and it comes about through these idealistic policies that sound good to anybody who's never had a job and doesn't understand or owned a business or signed the front of a paycheck and understand what it takes to make a profit. When you look throughout world history, there's a graph by a guy named Angus Madison, and the Angus Madison Project continued it, and it tracks back to the year zero. So if you're religious, the year that Christ was born. Through current times, GDP, gross domestic product per person, and the line is between like 1 and 2 on a scale of 50 for years and years and years, for centuries and centuries. And then the United States Constitution is signed, and it shoots. It looks literally like a hockey stick. And he also breaks it down by region. And you can see that after World War II, Japan shoots up. Now, Japan was industrialized before World War II, but it was a monarchy. All the money went to the monarchs. So it shoots up. GDP per person goes way up. Western Europe shoots way up after the fall of the National Socialists or the Nazis. When the Soviet Union falls, Eastern Europe shoots way up. When China implements red capitalism, China shoots way up. Poverty in China has gone from something like 31%, this is extreme poverty, to down to 2% since 1980 when they implemented red capitalism. These are fantastic numbers. Capitalism has lifted more people from the working and lower classes to the middle class and the upper class than any economic system ever devised. And it's time people started to recognize that and stop trying to hide behind people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who simply just have no idea what they're talking about.
I appreciate it. So let's talk about some specific policy issues, because you raise a lot of that in the book. You were, again, CEO of a major quick service restaurant chain. The minimum wage legislation directly impacted a large share of your workforce, relative to other industries. What do you think about minimum wage policy?
Look, the minimum wage at $7.25 I thought was too low. I actually argued that you could raise the minimum wage some. I don't think we need a minimum wage. I think it should be either at a municipal or a state level, because quite honestly, you're not going to have the same minimum wage in Seattle as you do in Birmingham, Alabama. That just doesn't make any sense. Seattle, you've got Amazon, and you've got very large corporations. That's a very wealthy area. In California, San Francisco is thriving and has very low unemployment because of Silicon Valley. But you go to Stockton, just a few miles in, and it was in bankruptcy. Municipalities are probably the best. Next best would be state. But if we're going to have a federal minimum wage, it's okay to raise it, but don't raise it above the level at which it will destroy entry-level jobs in the lowest economic areas. Because if you do that, you're going to hurt the very economic areas and the very workers that you think you're trying to help. The New York Times had an article in the late 80s that said the minimum wage should go to zero, that its time had come.
The editorial board.
Yeah, the editorial board. I don't know. What's changed economically since the late 80s that would make that, there's nothing that's changed since the late 80s that would make that irrelevant. So I think minimum wage is not something we should be pursuing. I do like the earned income tax credit.
You want to talk about why?
Yeah, it's funny, in California when the minimum wage went up, I think it went to $10 or $11, I can't remember which, but we had workers coming into our general managers in the restaurants and saying, we got to work less hours. Our general managers were stunned. They were like, what do you mean you got to work less hours? You just got to raise. Don't you want to work more hours? And they said, no, man, if I work the hours I'm working now, I'm going to lose my SNAP benefits, my food stamps. I'm going to lose my Section 8 housing. I'm going to lose my Medicaid. It was that welfare cliff where you get to the point where you make a little money, you make some money, and phew, all of a sudden you lose the benefits and you're taking home less money. Earned income tax credit sets a subsidy at a certain level, which would replace these other subsidies, like the food stamps and Section 8 and Medicaid. You probably still get Medicaid, but food stamps and Section 8. And as your income increases, your subsidy decreases, but it never decreases so much that you're taking home less when you're earning more. That's the thing to avoid. We always want people that are earning more to take home more. So it comes down, but but it comes down in proportion to how your earnings go up. Now, at some point it disappears because it continually goes down as you earn more. But you never take home fewer dollars as you work. And that's, if you're going to help people, that's how you help people. You don't help them by locking them into poverty. These people that were asking for fewer hours, they were stuck. They couldn't get out of poverty. The chasm between, what they had in poverty and the amount that they'd need to equal that amount was too great to cross. So I think earned income tax credit would be good. We need jobs training. We need significant job training, entrepreneurships, apprenticeships for kids who can't go to college. And look, some people shouldn't go to college. And quite honestly, there's nothing wrong with studying gender studies or philosophy. I majored in history. You can major in those things. But just don't think you're going to get out and get a job. The one poster that made me laugh during the Occupy Wall Street movement was a woman standing there saying, majored in gender studies, $130,000 in debt, no job. I'm thinking, what job did you think you were going to get? It was like, we're at that point we were in a recession too. This is what we were talking about earlier. There just weren't a lot of good-paying jobs. So we need to get a little more realism, I think, and with the younger generation. And I think they need to understand the benefits of capitalism versus socialism. But they need jobs. They need to get into the system. They need to get that pride and dignity that comes with work.
So you talk about jobs and the pride and dignity that come with work. A lot of people are worried about technological automation, and they're particularly worried about that in industries like the quick service food industry. Are you worried about the robots taking all the jobs? How do you see automation affecting the labor market?
It's funny. I'm going to take this into a little bigger context, but I'll answer it in the context of the Obama administration's economic policies, which coming out of a recession, the average would have been about 4% GDP growth. It never got much above 2%. He never had a full year of 3%. So people never really got good paying jobs in the Obama administration. And I would do interviews and we would talk about, well, Andy, people can't find jobs. The labor participation rate's going down because they're dropping out and they're working part-time jobs and entry-level jobs in your restaurants and trying to feed their families, and people are coming in and automating in manufacturing and in your restaurants, and the jobs are disappearing. And then President Trump comes in, and the reason, of course, was that businesses weren't investing in creating jobs because they were afraid of policies like Dodd-Frank, which killed community banks, and Obamacare, which shoved medical insurance expense down on businesses. And then there was this onslaught of regulation that you never knew the next crazy thing they were going to come up with. When President Trump got elected, optimism shot up like a rocket, and businesses began to invest. And then he cut taxes and cut regulation. And what we found is now we're in a position where after 16 months, just 16 months of his presidency, or 16 months since the election. It hasn't even been 16 months yet since president. I think it's been 15 months. We've got fewer people on unemployment benefits than has been the case in 44 years when the labor force was much smaller. So that's an incredible number. We have more people working than we've ever had working, and we have more job openings than we ever had. Just think about that. More people working and more job openings than we've ever had, and the unemployment rate at a 17-year low. Hasn't been this low since the Clinton administration. All the talk about automation, we have 400,000 job openings in manufacturing and 250,000 in construction. Everybody's hiring. Everybody wants employees. We've actually gone from an economy where the biggest problem was workers couldn't find good paying jobs to an economy where the big problem is employers can't find enough workers to fill the good paying jobs that exist. So automation was an excuse, just like every other excuse they tried to come up with to explain why, despite all the geniuses in the Obama administration, they never managed to get above 2.1% GDP growth. His last year in office, it was 1.5% GDP growth. So you had people like Larry Summers, who's a very highly respected economist, out there saying, well, believing the Trump administration was projecting 3% GDP growth. He was out there saying, no, he said, believing in that's like believing in tooth fairies. Literally, said that last May, so a year ago. Jason Furman, another famous Obama economist, said, no, we're 2% GDP growth for the next 10 years. Trying to explain that the reason that their economic policies failed must have been systemic. They're kind of circling the wagons. It was automation, it was people, it was baby boomers getting older. So first 3 quarters under President Trump, 3.1% GDP growth. CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, which is actually kind of a Keynesian group. I'm a little surprised by this, but they came out and projected 3.3% for next year and credited the tax cuts. Now, after that, they project 1.9% GDP growth, which is, between you and me, is just ridiculous. How could you have, with the tax cuts and regulatory relief, energy policy, all these things that encourage business, they're actually projecting that we'll have lower GDP growth than we had under Obama when he was doing everything he possibly could to discourage business growth. So those numbers don't make any sense. But I think for this year, they may have hit the nail on the head, and they even credit the tax cuts. The only year where they credit them, but they do credit it. So I think we're looking at the Trump boom, and it's a result of the capitalist comeback.
Hi everyone, thanks for watching part 1 of our discussion with Andrew Puzder. I hope you enjoyed what you saw. Remember to like the video or leave us a comment. And if you want to see more, check out part 2.